The story behind the Occupational Observer, a curious school newspaper. It is very surprising the things you can find on the internet, but a recent find was one of those jaw-dropping moments for me. A great deal of my life has been devoted to writing. I loved it, and I still do, and at times it was very profitable. I was looking for a copy of a newspaper from the late 1960s, which I worked on by contributing weekly articles of Bridgeport, Michigan history, and that was the Bridgeport Future. There was a newspaper that jumped off the page at me. In fact, I did a double take. Did I read it correctly? That newspaper was the Occupational Observer. Well, it had to be something other than the school newspaper that I created at Bridgeport Junior High School. The Occupational Observer was indeed the one of my creations, and there it was in that database, surprisingly. This little paper, though insanely popular with the teachers and classmates, was not an item I would have expected to find where I did. I mean, it was produced on a mimeograph machine, only about a couple hundred copies per issue, and only ran for 3 issues. So I'd like to share with you the story behind the Occupational Observer. I've been trying very hard to remember how the idea came to me. I was 12 years old and obsessed with newspapers, and I loved to write even then. And I knew the junior high school already had a newspaper, and the kids on it were quite uppity. I was not allowed to be on the staff because although I got great grades in English, however, when it came to math, I was totally inept, and one requirement was that you had to have excellent grades across the board. And thinking about all the classes offered, I zeroed in on one class where I could see my project work, and it was the occupational survey class taught by, I believe it was Mr. Boyteen. So I got my thoughts together and set up a meeting after school one afternoon to pitch my idea to him. And here was the basic plan as I tried to sell it to Mr. Boyteen. I suggested a monthly publication which would have features about occupations that the kids might be interested in the future and could be used in conjunction with Mr. Boyteen's occupational survey class, as there were no textbooks for that class. Mr. Boyteen not only liked it, he bought it hook, line, and sinker, and he agreed to take the teachers, to be the teacher sponsor, and that he would bring the idea up at the next school board meeting, as it would have to have their approval. And the meeting just happened to be the next night. I wanted to go to the meeting, but he felt it would be best if he approached them on his own. Since the idea was mine, he suggested that I be the editor-in-chief, which was fine with me, as it was just exactly what I wanted. And he also charged me with putting together a staff, another thing I would have pushed for but didn't have to. I had been thinking about who I would want, so I was going to pack it with friends that I had already selected. My classmates that I selected were Dwight McNally, who did Games and Jokes, Melody Chapman, who did features, Bonnie Taylor, who did features, Tim Basner, who was a reporter, Tom Marsh, who was a reporter, and I could hardly wait to get to school the next day. The board meeting had gone well, however, they would only authorize 200 copies to be printed of each edition. But I was happy, and Mr. Boyteen was also excited about the project, and we scheduled a staff meeting for the next day after school. I took their suggestions and then handed out assignments. I wanted to get an issue out right away, and once the articles were all turned in to me to review, they were then given to Mr. Boyteen, who in turn presented them to his wife, who did the actual layout and stencils. I had a great love of history. I mean, ever since I was a really little kid, I have. And I really believe that was what was inspired by a television show that I was obsessed with at the time, Dark Shadows. The show wove its way through different time periods, and, well, it was just a fascinating program which I rarely missed. So I wrote a 3-part series, The History of Bridgeport Township, where I lived, and it really did fit in well with didn't really fit in well with the occupational theme, but I was the editor, and I wanted it in, so it was. Those 3 articles were a hit, and indeed, over the next 3 years, took on a life of their own. I'll tell you about that in just a bit. Because the first issue was rushed out, it had a great many flaws, but that didn't seem to matter. Each of us on the staff got 2 copies, and the rest were handed out in about a half an hour. In the second issue, we took more time with, and it was a much improved product. Mr. Boyteen's wife actually added various colors to the titles, and Dwight McNally did a fine job on the cover, which showed a blacksmith shoeing a horse and a mechanic changing a car tire, sort of the evolution of horseshoes to tires, if you will. The second part of my Bridgeport history was published, but I added a new feature also, which was a history of Bridgeport's newspapers, and then there had been a lot of them. One of these papers had been published in the 1940s by Mr. Peter Willocks and was named The Bridgeporter. Well, issue 2 of Occupational Observer was in December, so we gave our paper a Christmas theme, of course. And in 1948, The Bridgeporter had an illustration of a very happy Santa, which was hand-drawn by Mr. Willocks, and it was very good. I laid the cover over a stencil and carefully went over the lines to reproduce the cover, which was used as an inside page in my paper. The second issue was a wrap and went over great. So plans began for our third issue, which we had no idea was going to be, unfortunately, our last. A lot of things were going on behind the scenes for me, good things in connection with Bridgeport and the weekly newspaper, the Bridgeport Future. Somehow, Elaine Jackson, a feature writer for the Bridgeport Future, got hold of me by phone and then came over to interview me about the Occupational Observer, but most specifically about the series of historical articles I was doing. We went into my library, which one of the rooms had been converted to after my brother Bill joined the military. I remember her being in awe at the size and diversity of the collection of published media that I had. But she was even more impressed with the Bridgeport historical items I had amassed, because people kept giving me things when they knew of my interest. The people were extremely generous. And at one time, I had the actual ballot box from the first township election in 1848. However, the box itself went back to the early 1700s. I believe it was Mrs. Jackson who put in my mind about doing an historical display, but I'm not sure. She took a few photos of me and then made a hasty retreat. The article turned out to be more about me than Bridgeport, and oddly, my appearance made me an outcast with fellow classmates. It was like overnight, and all the friends I had were gone except the few who worked on the newspaper with me. I never really understood that, but this marked the beginning of both an exciting time for me and a very troubled time because of being by myself after that article appeared. Actually, there was a bit of an insertion at the Occupational Observer that the staff convinced Mr. Boyteen that everyone should have a turn at being editor, which he approved of, and perhaps I should have gone along with that, but I felt a little hurt because it was my idea, it was mine. At least, that is how I felt back then. Now I would look at it differently. As we were working on issue 3, the one that was supposed to be my last as editor, there were so many other things that were going on and coming up that I left the Occupational Observer after that. The other staff members must not have had the bug I did for the project, as it folded with no number 4 issued. In retrospect, I was being jealous and selfish. Now, I should end the story of the Occupational Observer right here, but I would like to tell you more of what projects developed from that small school newspaper. I mentioned earlier about the Bridgeporter and Peter Willocks. Somehow he got a copy of the Occupational Observer where I had reproduced the Christmas cover of his 1948 newspaper and used it in mine. Mr. Willocks owned his own ad agency in Saginaw, and he contacted my parents first and then with me. He wanted permission for me to skip school with him one day so he could show me how the ad agency worked, which included watching some basic animation that was what was in production and was very fascinating. He had me hang at the different departments as well as with him so I could see how an ad agency worked. His Bridgeporter publication back in the 1940s was a good advertising vehicle. He and some other businessmen in Saginaw took me to the Fordney Hotel for lunch, and the Fordney burned down, but in its day it was the place to eat for the business class people. And what I remember most that day was the animator and the animation. It was really quite interesting. It was an exciting day for me, to be sure. And after he had had me over to his, afterwards he had me over to his house to watch football with him and talk, and eventually we sort of lost touch, unfortunately. My dad was kind of jealous of him, and of course when we moved in 1971 to Oscoda, about 100 miles north, I lost track of a lot of people that had been friends. The Bridgeport Future had plans for me also. And in May 1969, I got a call from the editor of the Bridgeport Future, and he told me he and his staff had a project that I might be interested in. So he invited me to the High Life Inn in Bridgeport to have a business luncheon. I was 13 years old, I think, 12 or 13, and I was getting a big head, really. He got Dad and Mom's permission, and a few days later, I would have my very first business luncheon. To say I was excited was an understatement. I knew Mom wanted to come, but decided it was better for me to do it on my own. Of the day, I don't remember a lot, except that at the table, we were at was very long, and the editor sat at the head of the table, and I was directly on his right. And I do remember that I had some really good mac and cheese, hamburgers, chocolate milk, and a chocolate shake to top it off. And after all of that, we got down to business. And coming up in August was the Bridgeport Future's first anniversary edition, and they wanted me to do all 16 pages of the paper with a history of Bridgeport Township. I remember the editor asking me if I could do it. I didn't know if I could or not, to be honest, but I said, sure, anyways. I had until the first week of August to get it done, so I set out right away interviewing some of the older residents, like Ella Preeter, who became a very dear and trusted friend, Julius Neverly, Mrs. Kennedy, another wonderful lady, as well as many, many more. It was a large project, and besides writing, I needed to assemble photos also. Mom gave me a hand with the writing of the piece. It turned out great, and I was ever so proud of the product, as well as the collaboration with my mom, Lorraine. I know she enjoyed it, Mom and me. Between 1968, when I got the idea for the Occupational Observer, through 1972, when I moved with Dad and Mom to Oscoda, in those few years, there were lots more things that happened, special events. I had 3 very nicely assembled historical displays with all my relics. I went to every township board meeting, instigating and organizing the Bridgeport Historical Society, which now has a great historical complex. But there were adults who did not like me back then. One was insanely jealous that a 13-year-old, I took the initiative to establish the museum, while he, in his late 50s, was so insanely jealous that he made sure my name, after we left Bridgeport, was taken off all of the records. The records show, though, of the township, as well as articles published in the Saginaw News and Bridgeport Future, that it was indeed I who organized, assembled, and created the Historical Society of Bridgeport. There's much more to tell of that era in my life that helped define who I was and where I am, but as they only indirectly tie into the Occupational Observer, well, perhaps look at those at a later time. Well, thanks for stopping by and taking a listen to my prattlings and ramblings on. You are appreciated. Have a great day, and God bless.